Every major religion has a founding story. For Israel, it was a night in Egypt, blood on a doorpost, a lamb without blemish, a people walking out of slavery before dawn. But that night was only the beginning. 14 centuries later, a man sat at a Passover table in Jerusalem, took the bread, and said, "This is my body." 2 days after that, a tomb was empty. The Passover did not end in Egypt. It was completed on a cross. This is that story. From the first lamb to the last. The story of Passover does not begin with a celebration. It begins with blood on a doorpost, a people holding their breath in the dark, and a promise that death would pass them by. The Hebrew word behind Passover is Pesach. It comes from a verb that means to pass over, to spare, or to leap across. That word carries the weight of an entire theology. The idea that judgment was moving through Egypt that night, and that something as simple as the blood of a lamb on the frame of a door was enough to stop it. Not the strength of the people inside, not their wisdom or their merit. The blood, that is the word the whole story is built on. And it is worth understanding from the start, because everything that comes after, the feast, the ritual, the prophecies, and eventually the cross, traces directly back to what happened in that single night. To understand why that night was necessary, you have to go back roughly 400 years. It started well, actually. A young man named Joseph, son of Jacob, was sold into slavery by his own brothers and ended up in Egypt. Through a series of events that had every mark of disaster, he rose to become the second most powerful man in the country, second only to Pharaoh himself. When a severe famine struck the entire region, Egypt was the only nation with food, and that was entirely because of Joseph's management. His family, the house of Israel, came down to Egypt and were welcomed. They settled, they multiplied, and for a generation or two, life was good. Then things changed. As recorded in Exodus 1, a new king rose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That phrase matters more than it sounds. It was not simply that this pharaoh had forgotten a historical figure. It meant he had no loyalty to the arrangement, no reason to honor what a previous dynasty had done. He looked at the growing population of Israelites and saw a threat. His response was to enslave them, put them to work on his building projects, make their lives harsh, and eventually order the death of every newborn Hebrew boy. 400 years of this, 4 centuries in which an entire people built cities for a king who considered them property. There is a passage in Exodus 2 that summarizes it in a few plain words, stating that during those long years the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and God heard their groaning. That phrase, "God heard," is not a small detail in the text. It is a turning point. The silence was ending. The death decree against Hebrew boys was already in effect when a woman from the tribe of Levi gave birth to a son. She hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she made a small basket of reeds, waterproofed it, and placed him among the reeds of the Nile River. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. What happened was improbable by any measure. Pharaoh's own daughter came to bathe at that part of the river. She found the basket, saw the baby, had compassion on him, and adopted him as her son. The boy's own mother was hired as a wet nurse to raise him, who'd paid wages by the very house that had ordered his death. He grew up inside the palace, educated in the full knowledge of Egyptian culture and power, and was given a name, Moses, meaning drawn from the water. It is one of those stories where the cruelty of the oppressor becomes the precise mechanism by which the deliverer is prepared. That is not coincidence working in Israel's favor. It is something else entirely. Moses' upbringing in the palace gave him access, literacy, leadership training. and an intimate understanding of how Egypt worked from the inside. None of that would have happened without the persecution. The man who would eventually stand before Pharaoh was raised in Pharaoh's house. Moses did not stay in the palace his whole life. After killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave, he fled and spent the next 40 years in the wilderness of Midian, working as a shepherd. Whatever ambitions he might have had were buried somewhere in the desert. He was 80 years old when everything changed again. Exodus 3 records what happened. Moses was tending a flock near the mountain of Horeb when he saw a bush on fire. That alone was not extraordinary in the dry heat of the Sinai wilderness. What stopped him was that the bush kept burning and was not consumed. He turned aside to look, and God spoke from the fire. The words that came from that bush were not the kind of abstract theological statement one might expect. God identified himself specifically as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then he said something that gives a fuller picture of those 400 years. He had seen the misery of his people. He had heard their cry, and he knew their suffering. He had come down to deliver them and bring them to a good land. He was sending Moses back to Egypt. Moses, by this point, was a man with no political standing, no army, and apparently no great confidence in his own voice. The exchange that follows in Exodus 3 and 4 is remarkably candid. Moses raises objection after objection, and God answers each one. Who am I to do this? God promises to be with him. What if they ask your name? God gives it. I am who I am. What if they don't believe me? God provides signs. I am not a good speaker. God appoints his brother Aaron to speak alongside him. The bush stopped burning, and Moses turned back toward Egypt. What followed was not a quick negotiation. Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh with a message: "Let the people of Israel go." Pharaoh refused. Then came the plagues. It would be easy to read the 10 plagues as simply a display of raw divine power, a demonstration of who was stronger. But there was a deeper logic at work. Egypt was a civilization with an elaborate pantheon of gods, and several of those gods were directly tied to the natural forces that the plagues targeted. The Nile turning to blood was not just an environmental disaster. The Nile was considered sacred, tied to the god Hapi. Frogs were associated with the goddess Heket. The sun being darkened for 3 days was a direct humiliation of Ra, the sun god, who stood at the center of Egyptian religious life. Pharaoh himself was considered a god, a son of Ra. The plagues, one by one, were dismantling the theological foundations of an empire. Throughout all of it, the region of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was consistently spared. The flies did not go there. The livestock plague did not reach their animals. The thick darkness that settled over Egypt for 3 days left Goshen untouched. This distinction was not accidental. It was part of the message, showing that the God of Israel was not simply the strongest power in a room full of powers, but was acting with intent and precision, protecting his people in the middle of the storm. Pharaoh's resistance broke and reformed several times. He would agree to release the Israelites, then pull back once a plague lifted. The cycle continued until the 10th plague was announced. And at that point, nothing would be the same. The final plague was different in nature from everything that had come before. The others had targeted Egypt's land, its water, its livestock, its economy. This one would reach inside every household in the country and take the firstborn son, from the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne down to the firstborn of every servant, and even the firstborn of the livestock. Before that night arrived, God gave specific instructions to Moses and Aaron. These instructions were not vague. They were detailed, precise, and had to be followed exactly. A lamb was to be selected, blood was to be applied to the doorposts, the meal was to be eaten in a particular way. This was not merely a survival protocol. Gee, it was the institution of a feast that would be kept for generations. The night came. The destroying force moved through Egypt, and in every house where the blood was absent, someone died. In Goshen, the families of Israel sat inside their homes, their sandals still on, their bags already packed, eating the meal God had instructed. Outside, Egypt was breaking apart. Pharaoh, who had refused to let the people go through 9 consecutive catastrophes, sent for Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and told them to take the Israelites and leave, and to bless him on the way out. After 400 years, Israel walked out of Egypt. That was the first Passover. Everything else this story contains, the feast, the prophecies, the Last Supper, the cross, extends from that single night. The blood on the doorpost was not the end of something. It was the beginning of one of the longest threads in all of Scripture. God did not leave the instructions open to interpretation. Every step of what Israel was to do that night was given with a specificity that stands out even within the detailed legal sections of the Old Testament. And when you look closely at each requirement, it becomes clear that nothing was arbitrary. The instructions begin in Exodus 12. On the 10th day of the month, each household was to select a lamb. Not any lamb, a male, 1 year old without defect. Families that were too small to consume an entire animal were to share one with their nearest neighbor, calculating the portions according to what each household could actually eat. Nothing was to go to waste. The lamb was then to be kept alive until the 14th day of the month. 4 days. That detail is easy to skip over, but it meant the family lived alongside the animal for almost a week before the sacrifice. In a context where livestock was both livelihood and daily companion, 4 days was enough time to know the animal, to observe it, and to confirm it had no hidden defect. This was not a casual offering. It required deliberate attention. Then, at twilight on the 14th day, the lamb was slaughtered. The Hebrew phrase used for that time, Bin ha'arbeim, literally means between the 2 evenings, a period that ancient Jewish tradition placed between the sun's decline and full darkness. It was not an approximate window. It was a specific hour at the end of the day, when the last light of the afternoon was giving way to night. As we will see later in this story, that detail becomes significant far beyond Egypt. Once the lamb was killed, the blood was to be collected and applied to the 2 doorposts and the upper frame, the lintel, of the house where the meal would be eaten. The instrument for this was a bundle of hyssop, a plant that grew commonly in that region and was used in various purification rites throughout the Old Testament. The act of applying blood to a doorframe was not foreign to ancient Near Eastern culture. Some scholars have noted that certain dedication rituals in that world involved marking thresholds with blood as a way of consecrating a space or identifying it as belonging to a particular household or deity. Whether the Israelites recognized that resonance or not, the gesture carried a clear meaning in the context God gave it. The blood was a sign. Exodus 12:13 records God's words directly on this point. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. The sign was not for Israel's benefit, not primarily. God did not need to be shown the blood in order to distinguish between houses. The instruction was theological in nature. It was asking Israel to act, to mark their homes deliberately, to make a visible declaration of where they stood. Faith in this case was not a feeling. It was a gesture performed at a doorpost with hyssop and blood. There is something else worth noting here: the shape formed by the application. Blood on the left post, the right post, and across the top, framed the entrance of the home completely. Anyone leaving or entering would pass under and between the blood. The household existed that night within the boundaries of that mark. The lamb itself was to be roasted over fire, not boiled, not eaten raw. Specifically roasted. Every part of it was to be eaten. The head, the legs, the inner parts. What remained by morning was to be burned completely. The animal was consumed entirely or destroyed. None of it was left to the ordinary business of the following day. Alongside the lamb, 2 other elements were required at the table: unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Unleavened bread, matzah in Hebrew, is bread made without yeast. In the normal rhythm of baking, yeast needs time to work. You mix it into the dough, and you wait. The absence of leaven that night was a direct reflection of the absence of time. There was no waiting. Israel was leaving, and the bread had to be made quickly. But the instruction to eat unleavened bread was not just a practical accommodation to the rush of the evening. It would become a week-long observance extending well beyond that night, and the New Testament would later use leaven as a symbol of corruption, something small that spreads through a whole batch if left unchecked. The unleavened bread carried weight in both directions. The bitter herbs are perhaps the most emotionally direct element of the meal. In Hebrew, merah, bitterness. These were plants with a sharp, bitter taste, and they were eaten as a reminder of the bitterness of slavery. Not as punishment, not as penance, but as memory. The meal was designed so that the body would physically experience something of what those 400 years had felt like. You could not eat that night without tasting bitterness on your tongue. Together, these 3 elements, lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, formed a meal that was simultaneously a sacrifice, a farewell dinner, and a liturgy. Each component told part of the story. The manner in which the meal was eaten was as deliberate as the food itself. God's instructions in Exodus 12 were explicit. The people were to eat with their cloaks tucked into their belts, sandals on their feet, and staff in hand. They were to eat it quickly. This is a remarkable detail. The meal that would become one of the most ceremonially observed feasts in Jewish history was originally eaten standing up, dressed for travel, with no indication of how long they would have before they needed to move. Think about what that required. Israel had been in Egypt for 400 years. Most of the people alive that night had been born there. Egypt was not a foreign land they were visiting. It was home in every practical sense. Their houses were there, their tools, their animals, their graves. To eat that meal with sandals on and a staff in hand was to declare, before anything had actually happened, that they were leaving. That posture was not a reaction to events. It was an anticipation of them. The people dressed and ate as if the deliverance had already occurred, even while the night was still dark and the destroying force had not yet passed. That gap between the instruction and the fulfillment, between putting on your sandals and actually walking out the door, is where faith lives. At midnight, the account in Exodus 12 says, "The Lord struck down every firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, and the firstborn of every animal." There was not a single house in Egypt where someone did not die that night. What followed was something Exodus describes with striking restraint. Pharaoh rose in the night, and all his officials, and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt. The text does not linger on the grief. It simply registers the sound. a cry that spread from house to house across the entire country, simultaneously, in the middle of the night, as family after family discovered what had happened. In Goshen, the region where the Israelites lived, there was no such cry. The contrast between those two realities existing at the same time, in the same country, only a few miles apart, is one of the most quietly dramatic elements of the whole narrative. Egypt was breaking in the dark. Goshen was still. The difference between the two was not geography, or ethnicity, or even righteousness. It was the blood on the doorposts. One question the text raises but does not fully answer is what became of the firstborn children of the slaves. Exodus 12:29 specifically includes them. The firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. These were not free Egyptians. They were prisoners, the lowest members of Egyptian society, people who had no more power over Pharaoh's decisions than the Israelites did. Jewish tradition has wrestled with this passage for centuries. Some rabbinical commentators argued that the slaves suffered the same plagues as their Egyptian masters, because, unlike the Israelites, they had not cried out to God for deliverance, or because they had actually benefited from Israel's labor, enjoying better treatment while the Hebrews did the harder work. Other interpretations have seen in this detail an acknowledgement that judgment, when it falls on a nation, does not sort neatly by guilt. What the text does not suggest is that this was an oversight, or that God miscalculated. The deaths in Egypt that night were not collateral damage in the ordinary sense of the phrase. The entire sequence of 10 plagues had been building toward a reckoning with a system, the Egyptian Empire, that had enslaved and killed children for 400 years. The death of firstborn sons in Egypt was, among other things, a direct mirror of Pharaoh's own decree at the beginning of Exodus. Kill every Hebrew boy born to them. The night did not end quietly, but for Israel, it ended with something that had seemed impossible for 400 years, an open road and a Pharaoh telling them to leave. Before Israel left Egypt, before the cry spread through the night, before a single sandal touched the road out of the country, God did something that might seem like an administrative detail, but was in fact a profound declaration. He reset the calendar. Exodus 12:2 records the instruction clearly. This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year. The month in question was what would later be known as Nisan, falling roughly in March or April by the modern calendar. Prior to this moment, Israel likely followed a calendar that began in autumn, in the month of Tishri, a reckoning that in many ways still governs the Jewish civil year today. The change was not bureaucratic. When God said this month shall be your first month, He was saying something about how Israel was now to measure time itself. The year would no longer begin in the season of harvest, the natural rhythm of the agricultural world. It would begin here, in the memory of a night when slaves became a free people. History for Israel was to be dated from liberation. This is one of the quieter but more theologically charged moments in the entire Passover account. God was not simply establishing a feast. He was reorienting an entire people's relationship with time. Every year, when the month of Nisan arrived, it would carry within it the reminder that time itself, for this nation, began with an act of God's deliverance. The instructions God gave in Exodus 12 and 13 are among the most detailed ritual prescriptions found anywhere in the Torah, and they were given before Israel had even left the country. This is worth pausing on. The feast was not instituted after the fact, as a commemoration of something that had already happened. The instructions came first. Israel was told how to remember an event that, as they received the instructions, had not yet occurred. That sequence changes how the ritual reads. It was not nostalgia. It was not a group of people gathering years later to preserve the memory of something they had experienced. The feast was woven into the event itself. Part of the same act, the same night, the same obedience. The core of the observance was simple enough that a family could keep it. A lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, specific timing. But the instructions extended well beyond the meal itself. Exodus 13 adds further layers. The consecration of every firstborn male, human and animal, to God, in recognition of the night when Israel's firstborn was spared while Egypt died. The firstborn belonged to God because God had spared them. There was also a strong pedagogical dimension built into the structure of the feast. Exodus 12:26-27 anticipates the question that children would inevitably ask: what does this ceremony mean to you? The answer was not an explanation of ancient events. It was a declaration. It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and spared our homes. The feast was designed to generate questions from the youngest members of the household and to create the occasion for the story to be told again, out loud, at a table. The instruction to tell the story was not optional. It was built into the architecture of the meal. Passover was not a single-night event. It opened a week-long observance called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, during which no leaven was to be found in any Israelite home. This was not simply a dietary restriction. The removal of leaven from the household was thorough and deliberate. Families searched their homes and cleared out every trace of it. The house was to be clean of it entirely. The 7 days carried a meaning that the single night of Passover could not fully express on its own. One night communicates urgency, crisis, a decisive moment. 7 days communicates something else, a sustained way of living, a prolonged state of being. For a full week, every meal was eaten without leaven. The physical experience of eating differently, day after day, was itself a form of remembrance. On the day after the Sabbath within this week, the first day of the week, by that reckoning, came another observance that would prove to carry extraordinary weight in the New Testament, the Feast of First Fruits, known in Hebrew as Bikurim. On that day, the first sheaf of the barley harvest was brought to the priest and waved before the Lord. It was an acknowledgement that the harvest belonged to God, and that this offering was the beginning, the first fruits, of what was to come. The timing of this feast, embedded within the Passover week, would later become the precise moment chosen for an event that the New Testament identifies as the fulfillment of everything the feast had pointed toward. But that is a later part of this story. What matters here is the shape of the week as a whole. It began with the Passover sacrifice, moved through 7 days of unleavened bread, and closed with the offering of the first fruits, death, purification, and new beginning, all compressed into one liturgical sequence, observed every year by every generation. One of the less discussed aspects of the original Passover instructions is who was permitted to take part in it. The initial night in Egypt was observed by the households of Israel. But as the feast was formalized as an annual observance, the question of participation became more complex. Numbers 9 addresses a case that had apparently already arisen in the wilderness, a group of men who were ritually unclean due to contact with a dead body, and therefore could not observe the Passover at the appointed time. They came to Moses and Aaron with the question directly: why should we be kept from presenting the Lord's offering at the appointed time among the Israelites? The response was a provision for a second Passover, 1 month later, for those who had been unable to observe the first. The feast was important enough that a second date was created rather than allowing any Israelite to simply miss it. But what about non-Israelites? Exodus 12 had already addressed this. A foreigner living among them could participate, but only under one condition. Every male in his household had to be circumcised. Circumcision, in the context of the Abrahamic covenant, was the mark of belonging, the sign that someone had entered into the covenant community. Without it, participation in the Passover was not permitted. With it, the foreigner was to be treated exactly as a native-born Israelite. As Exodus 12:49 put it, the same law applies to the native-born and to the foreigner residing among you. The door was not closed to outsiders, but entering through it required a genuine identification with the covenant community, not merely a desire to observe an interesting ritual. Passover was not a cultural event that anyone could attend. It was a covenant meal, and the covenant had to be entered first. Perhaps the most striking feature of how God designed this feast is found in a phrase in Exodus 13:8. Speaking of what parents were to tell their children during the week of unleavened bread, the text says, "You shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt." For me, not for them, not for our ancestors, for me. The Passover Haggadah, the text used in the traditional Jewish Passover Seder, makes this explicit. It states that every person in every generation is obligated to see themselves as if they personally had come out of Egypt. The feast was not designed to honor the memory of people who were no longer alive. It was designed to collapse the distance between the original event and whoever was sitting at the table in the present moment. This is a fundamentally different relationship with history than the one most cultures maintain. We tend to commemorate the past by marking our distance from it. We remember what happened to those people back then so that we do not forget where we came from. The Passover operates on a different logic entirely. The past is not something to be observed from a distance. It is something to be entered, re-experienced at the level of the body, through the taste of bitter herbs, through the texture of unleavened bread, through the retelling of the story out loud at a table surrounded by the people you love. That design has kept the feast alive for more than 3,000 years, not because it is a moving tradition or because the story is compelling, though it is both of those things, but because it asks each person who sits down at the table to answer a question that has no historical safe distance. What would I have done, and who would I have been? On the night the blood was placed on the doorposts, 40 years passed between the first Passover in Egypt and the next significant one recorded in Scripture. 40 years of wilderness, of a generation dying out, of a people carrying the memory of Egypt, while learning what it meant to live under the direct governance of God. When Israel finally crossed the Jordan River and entered Canaan, the first thing they did on the other side was not build a fortification or scout the territory. They camped at a place called Gilgal, and they kept the Passover. Joshua 5 records this moment. On the 14th day of the first month, the exact date prescribed in Exodus, Israel observed the feast on the plains of Jericho. The following day, they ate from the produce of the land for the first time, unleavened bread and roasted grain. And the day after that, the manna stopped. For 40 years, manna had appeared on the ground each morning. It had been the daily visible sign of God's provision in the wilderness, something that required no farming, no planning, no effort beyond the gathering. The moment Israel ate from the land of Canaan, it ceased entirely. It was as if two chapters of a long story had a natural boundary between them, and the Passover at Gilgal was the marker placed at that boundary. The timing was deliberate in a way that rewards attention. Israel entered the land and immediately observed the feast that commemorated their exit from Egypt. Before a single battle was fought, before Jericho fell, before anything in Canaan had been claimed, they sat down and remembered where they had come from. Whatever was ahead of them, they were not going to begin it without first returning to the night the whole journey had started. Several centuries later, Israel had divided into two kingdoms, accumulated a long record of unfaithfulness, and lost touch with most of what the law required. The northern kingdom was already gone, carried off by Assyria in 722 BC. The southern kingdom of Judah was in a precarious state, spiritually and politically, when a king named Hezekiah came to the throne. Hezekiah moved quickly. In the first year of his reign, he reopened and repaired the temple in Jerusalem, which had been closed and neglected under his father Ahaz. He restored the priesthood to its proper function, cleared the temple of the objects that had been brought in for the worship of foreign gods, and then turned his attention to the Passover. 2 Chronicles 30 tells the story of what happened next, and it is genuinely unusual. Hezekiah wanted to observe the Passover in the proper month, but the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient numbers, and the people had not gathered in Jerusalem in time. Rather than cancel the observance or reduce it to a formality, Hezekiah consulted with his officials and the whole assembly, and they decided to keep the Passover in the second month instead. Invoking the same provision that had been given in Numbers 9 for those who were ritually unprepared, he then sent couriers throughout what remained of Israel and Judah, inviting anyone who was willing to come to Jerusalem for the feast. The invitation extended even into the territories of the former northern kingdom, to people whose religious practice had been compromised for generations. The response was mixed. 2 Chronicles notes that some mocked the couriers and laughed at them, but many from the north came anyway. The gathering that assembled in Jerusalem was larger than anything seen since the time of Solomon. The celebration lasted 14 days instead of the prescribed 7. And at the end of it, 2 Chronicles 30:26 records a remarkable assessment. There had been nothing like it in Jerusalem since the days of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. A feast that had been neglected and forgotten was restored to the center of national life, and it drew people from the ruins of a kingdom that no longer existed. Less than a century after Hezekiah, another reforming king sat on the throne of Judah. Josiah came to power as a child and began seeking God earnestly while still young. In his 18th year, during a renovation of the temple, a priest named Hilkiah found something that had apparently been lost or forgotten: the book of the law. When the scroll was read to Josiah, he tore his clothes. The text of the law made clear how far Judah had drifted from what God had required, and Josiah understood immediately what that meant. He launched one of the most comprehensive religious reforms in the entire history of the monarchy, tearing down altars to foreign gods, destroying high places, burning the objects of Asherah worship, and removing from the temple everything that had been brought in for the worship of other deities. Then he kept the Passover. 2 Kings 23:21-23 records his instruction to the people: "Keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant." What follows is a statement that stands out sharply in the text. No such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel or of the kings of Judah. Not since before the monarchy. Not even Hezekiah's celebrated Passover, according to this account, matched what Josiah convened. 2 Chronicles 35 provides considerably more detail about how it was conducted. The organization of the priests and Levites, the number of animals provided, the careful attention to the prescriptions of the law. Josiah personally contributed 30,000 lambs and goats and 3,000 cattle for the Passover offerings. The feast was observed with a precision and scale that had not been seen in living memory, and yet within a generation of Josiah's death, Jerusalem would fall to Babylon. His reforms did not outlast him. The Passover he kept stands in the historical record not as the beginning of a new era, but as a final brightness before a very long darkness. The gap between the observances recorded in Scripture is in some ways more instructive than the observances themselves. Between the Passover at Gilgal under Joshua and the one under Hezekiah, there is no record of a national Passover being kept. That is roughly 700 years. 700 years. This was not a period of smooth continuity in which the feast was kept quietly without being mentioned. The historical books of the Old Testament, Judges, Samuel, Kings, paint a recurring picture of a people who cycled through faithfulness and apostasy, regularly adopting the religious practices of surrounding nations and allowing the distinctives of their covenant identity to erode. The Passover as the feast that most directly embodied that identity. The story of what God had done, the meal that asked each generation to see themselves as participants in the Exodus, was among the first things to disappear when Israel stopped taking the covenant seriously. This is not a minor observation. The feast was not incidental to Israel's faith. It was its founding narrative, rehearsed annually, designed to be the frame through which every generation understood who they were and who God was to them. Losing the Passover was not like losing a tradition. It was like losing the story. And a people who have lost their story become vulnerable to whatever alternative story the surrounding culture offers, which is precisely what happened repeatedly throughout the period of the Judges and the divided monarchy. The connection between the neglect of the Passover and the spiritual condition of Israel is not spelled out explicitly in the text, but it runs through the whole narrative like an undercurrent. The years when the feast was forgotten were years when Israel worshipped other gods, oppressed the poor, and forgot the fundamental premise of their own existence: that they were a people who had been slaves and had been set free, not by their own strength, but by blood on a doorpost. Jerusalem fell to Babylon in 586 BC. The temple was destroyed. The leading citizens of Judah were deported. For 70 years, Israel lived in exile in a foreign land, with no temple, no sacrifice, and no way to observe the Passover in the form God had originally prescribed. When Cyrus the Great of Persia issued his decree, allowing the Jews to return to their land and rebuild the temple, a community made the journey back. The rebuilding of the temple was slow, contested, and emotionally complicated. Ezra 3 records that when the foundation was finally laid, the older men who had seen the first temple wept, while the younger ones shouted for joy, and the two sounds were indistinguishable from a distance. Ezra 6 records what happened once the temple was completed and dedicated. The returned exiles kept the Passover. On the 14th day of the first month, the priests and Levites who had purified themselves slaughtered the lambs for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests and for themselves. Then Ezra 6:21 adds a detail that echoes the inclusivity of the original Passover instructions. Also, the Israelites who had returned from exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. The feast after the exile was not triumphant in the way Hezekiah's or Josiah's had been. The community was small. The temple was a shadow of what Solomon had built, and the land was under Persian governance. But they kept it. After 70 years of silence, in a rebuilt temple with tears not far from the surface, Israel ate the Passover again. And the story that had almost been lost was handed back to the next generation. While Israel was observing and forgetting and rediscovering the Passover across these centuries, something else was happening in the prophetic literature. Certain prophets were describing a future figure in language that pointed unmistakably back to the Passover lamb, though none of them appear to have fully understood what they were drawing. Isaiah 53 is the most striking of these passages. Written roughly 700 years before the first century, it describes a servant of God who is led like a sheep to the slaughter and like a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he does not open his mouth. This servant bears the sins of many, is pierced for transgressions, and through his wounds healing comes to others. He is given a grave with the wicked, but is with the rich in his death. The imagery is not abstract. It is the imagery of sacrifice, and specifically of a sacrifice in which an innocent animal dies in place of those who deserve the consequence. Jeremiah 31 adds a different dimension. God speaks through Jeremiah of a new covenant, one that would not be like the covenant made when Israel came out of Egypt. This new covenant would be written on hearts rather than stone tablets, and God would forgive iniquity and remember sin no more. The reference point for what this new covenant would surpass is again the Exodus. The Passover had established the old covenant. Something was coming that would establish a new one. Zechariah 12:10 adds the sharpest detail of all. God speaks in the first person. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. A pierced figure mourned like a firstborn son. The language reaches back to the night in Egypt and forward to a death that had not yet occurred. None of these prophets named what they were describing. They wrote what they saw in the language available to them and left it for later generations to place within the larger story. The pieces were there for anyone who read them carefully. What was missing was the event that would make them all suddenly, unmistakably coherent. That event was still several centuries away. By the 1st century, the Passover was no longer observed the way it had been in Egypt. The original instructions had assumed a household, a family inside a home, blood on a doorpost, a lamb roasted and eaten before dawn. But with the construction of the temple in Jerusalem and the development of the Levitical sacrificial system, the feast had taken on a different form. The lamb was now brought to the temple, slaughtered by the priests, and the blood was poured at the base of the altar. Families from across the region, and eventually from across the known world, it made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem every year for the feast. Jesus grew up doing this. Luke 2:41 notes that his parents went to Jerusalem every year for the Passover. It was on one such trip, when Jesus was 12 years old, that he stayed behind in the temple while his parents began the journey home. The episode that ends with Mary and Joseph finding him 3 days later, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. That detail is often treated as a charming story about a precocious child, but its location within the Passover narrative is not accidental. The boy, who would later be called the Lamb of God, was already at home in the temple during the feast that the Lamb had defined. Throughout his adult ministry, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for the Passover consistently. The Gospel of John records at least 3 separate Passover visits before the final one, giving a sense of rhythm. The annual pilgrimage, the crowds, the city swelling with visitors from across the diaspora. By the time of his last journey to Jerusalem, he was not simply observing a feast. He was arriving at the moment toward which everything had been building. The arrangements for what would become the Last Supper are recorded in all three synoptic Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the details taken together reveal a degree of deliberate planning that is easy to miss on a first reading. Mark 14 and Luke 22 describe the moment when the disciples asked Jesus where he wanted them to prepare the Passover meal. His response was specific. He told two of them, Luke identifies them as Peter and John, to go into the city, where they would meet a man carrying a jar of water. They were to follow him, and when he entered a house, they were to say to the owner that the teacher asked where the guest room was, in which he could eat the Passover with his disciples. The owner would then show them a large upper room, already furnished. Everything they needed would be there. A man carrying a jar of water was an unusual sight in first-century Jerusalem. That work was typically done by women. Some scholars have suggested this may have been a prearranged signal, a way of identifying a contact in a city crowded with Passover pilgrims without the location being communicated openly in advance. Whether or not that reading is correct, the scene has the quality of something organized ahead of time, quietly and precisely, in a way that the disciples had not been informed of until the moment they needed to act. The upper room itself, the anagaion in Greek, meaning a room on an upper floor, was furnished and ready. The Greek word used suggests it was laid out with all the furnishings appropriate for a reclining meal, the posture adopted at the Passover Seder since the post-exilic period as a symbol of freedom. Slaves ate standing or crouching. Free people reclined. By the 1st century, reclining at the Passover table was itself a statement. We are no longer in Egypt. One of the most discussed questions in New Testament scholarship concerns the precise timing of the Last Supper. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, appear to present the meal as the Passover meal itself, eaten on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, the night the Passover lamb was traditionally consumed. John's Gospel, however, seems to place the crucifixion on the day the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple, which would mean the Last Supper happened the evening before the official Passover meal. The two accounts appear on the surface to contradict each other. Scholars have proposed various ways of resolving this. One significant suggestion draws on evidence that different Jewish communities in the 1st century used different calendrical systems. Some groups, including possibly a community connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls, observe the Passover on a different day from the official temple calendar. Under this reading, Jesus may have observed the feast according to one calendar, while the temple priesthood operated on another, which would explain why he was crucified at the very hour the official Passover lambs were being killed. Other scholars have argued that John is not making a chronological claim, but a theological one. Placing the death of Jesus at the moment of the temple sacrifice to underline the typological significance rather than to contradict the synoptic timeline. What both accounts agree on, regardless of how the calendrical question is resolved, is the essential meaning of the moment. Jesus was keeping the Passover, or being offered as the Passover, in Jerusalem during the feast, in the presence of his disciples. The connection to the Exodus night was not incidental. It was the whole point. By the 1st century, the Passover Seder had developed a structure significantly more elaborate than what Exodus 12 describes. The meal was organized around 4 cups of wine, each associated with one of the 4 promises God made to Israel in Exodus 6:6-7. I will bring you out, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, I will take you as my own people. The 4 cups were drunk at specific points throughout the evening. The first, the cup of sanctification, opened the meal. The second, the cup of plagues, came after the recounting of the Exodus story, the Haggadah, Matins, and the listing of the 10 plagues. The third, the cup of redemption, followed the main meal itself. The fourth, the cup of praise, closed the evening after the singing of the final Hallel Psalms. Psalms 115 through 118. Luke 22:20 records that after the supper, Jesus took a cup and said, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." The phrase "after the supper" places this cup following the main meal, which corresponds to the third cup, the cup of redemption. It is also worth noting what happened after the meal. Matthew 26:30 records that when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The hymn sung at the close of the Passover Seder was traditionally the second portion of the Hallel, Psalms 115 to 118. Psalm 118 includes the line that Jesus had quoted earlier in his ministry, referring to himself. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The disciples may not have fully grasped it at the time, but the song they sang on the way to Gethsemane was already speaking about what was about to happen. At some point during the meal, Jesus did something that had no precedent in the Passover tradition. He took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples with words that reframed everything on the table. Luke 22:19 records him saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The phrase "in remembrance of me" carries a direct echo of the Passover's own logic. The feast designed so that each generation would relive the Exodus as if they themselves had come out of Egypt. Jesus was not simply adding a new layer of meaning to an existing ritual. He was placing himself at the center of the memory the feast was meant to preserve. Then he took the cup. The words recorded across the Synoptic Gospels carry slight variations, but the core is consistent. "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many." Matthew 26:28 adds the phrase for the forgiveness of sins. The blood of the covenant was language with deep roots in the Exodus narrative. In Exodus 24, when Moses took the blood of sacrifices and threw half of it against the altar and half on the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you." What Jesus said that evening was not a departure from the Passover. It was its destination. The lamb had always pointed somewhere. The blood on the doorpost had always been a sign of something larger than one night in Egypt. At that table, the one who had been described by Isaiah as a lamb led to slaughter, described by Jeremiah as the mediator of a new covenant, described by Zechariah as the pierced figure mourned like a firstborn son. That one sat at the Passover table and told his disciples that the bread and the cup were his body and his blood. The disciples did not understand it fully that night. They would not understand it fully until after the weekend had passed. But the words had been spoken and the meal had been changed. From a feast that looked backward to a liberation in Egypt, to one that looked forward and backward simultaneously, to a sacrifice not yet completed, and to one that had echoed through 14 centuries of lambs and blood and doorposts. What makes the account of the Last Supper difficult to read as simply a theological event is that it is also profoundly human, and not in a comfortable way. The table where Jesus instituted what would become one of the most observed rites in Christian history was also the table where betrayal and denial were already in motion. John 13 records that Jesus, knowing what was coming, got up from the meal, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash his disciples' feet. This was a task performed by servants, sometimes by the lowest-ranking servants in a household. Peter resisted. "Lord, you shall never wash my feet." Jesus told him plainly, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Peter's response swung to the other extreme immediately. "Then not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." The same impulsiveness that would later lead him to draw a sword in the garden and then deny any knowledge of Jesus in a courtyard was already visible at the table in a moment of genuine but poorly understood devotion. Judas was also there. All 4 Gospels place him at the meal. John's account is particularly stark. Jesus dipped a piece of bread and handed it to Judas, and John 13:27 states that after Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus told him, "What you are about to do, do it quickly." The others at the table did not understand what was happening. Some thought Jesus was telling Judas, who handled the group's money, to go buy something for the feast or to give something to the poor. Judas left, and the night continued. The contrast is striking and worth sitting with. At the table where the new covenant was being established, where Jesus spoke the words that would be repeated in churches for 2,000 years, one disciple was about to hand him over for 30 pieces of silver, and another would deny him 3 times. Before sunrise, the Last Supper was not a serene liturgical occasion attended by people who understood what was happening. It was a meal shared between a man who knew exactly what was coming and friends who largely did not, and one who had already decided to act against him. That texture is part of the account. It is not softened by the Gospels, and it should not be softened now. The new covenant was not established in ideal conditions among people who were equal to the moment. It was established in the ordinary mess of human loyalty and failure, which is precisely where it has continued to operate ever since. Before Jesus had performed a single miracle recorded in John's Gospel, before he had gathered his disciples or delivered a sermon, a man standing by the Jordan River looked at him walking past and said something that has echoed through Christian theology ever since. John 1:29 records the words, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." John the Baptist said this in public to whoever was within earshot. He repeated a version of it the following day, and then 2 of his own disciples left him and followed Jesus instead. The statement was not explained in the moment. John did not stop to unpack the theology behind it, or draw a line from the Lamb of Exodus 12 to the man walking along the riverbank. He simply said it as if it was something he had understood and needed to declare, whatever prompted those words, whether it came from direct revelation, from his deep immersion in the prophetic texts, or from the experience of baptizing Jesus and witnessing what followed. John identified Jesus in the language of the Passover before the public ministry had even properly begun. That identification set the frame for everything that came after. The Gospel of John, more than any other, builds its account of Jesus' life around the Passover calendar and the imagery of sacrifice. By the time the crucifixion arrives in John's narrative, the reader has been prepared, not by argument, but by accumulation, to see it as something other than a political execution. The connection between the crucifixion and the Passover sacrifice is not only theological, it is chronological, and the precision of the timing across sources that approach it from different angles is difficult to explain as coincidence. In the 1st century, the Passover lambs were slaughtered in the temple courts on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. The Mishnah, the early Jewish legal text compiled around 200 AD, records that this slaughter began at midday and continued through the afternoon. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, describes the practice in similar terms, noting that the priests began the sacrifice in the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon by our reckoning, or earlier when the feast fell on a Friday, as it did that year, so that the work could be completed before the Sabbath began at sundown. John 19:14 places the moment when Pilate handed Jesus over for crucifixion at around the 6th hour. Noon. Mark 15:25 records that the crucifixion itself began at the 3rd hour. True. 9 in the morning. Matthew 27:45-46 records that darkness fell over the land from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, and that at the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice and died. 3 in the afternoon, the same hour, the temple priests were drawing the blood of the Passover lambs and pouring it at the base of the altar. In the upper city, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims were preparing for the feast. In the temple courts, the sacrifice was underway, and outside the city walls, on a hill called Golgotha, the man John the Baptist had called the Lamb of God breathed his last. The Gospels do not make this explicit connection in a footnote or a theological aside. They simply record the times. The reader is left to place them side by side. Among the regulations governing the Passover lamb in Exodus 12, one instruction stands out for its specificity. The bones of the lamb were not to be broken. Exodus 12:46 states it plainly, "You shall not break any of its bones." The same instruction appears again in Numbers 9:12. It was not an incidental detail. It was a repeated requirement, part of the precise form the sacrifice was to take. Roman crucifixion normally ended when the executioners wanted to accelerate death, with a procedure called the crurifragium, the breaking of the legs. Without the ability to push up with their legs, victims could no longer relieve the pressure on their chest and would die from asphyxiation within minutes. It was a practical measure, not a punishment. Pilate had given instructions for the bodies to be removed before the Sabbath began, so the soldiers came to break the legs of the 3 men who had been crucified. John 19:32-33 records what happened. The soldiers broke the legs of the first man and then the other. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead. There was no need to break his legs. John 19:36 then draws the connection directly. These things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. The verse he cites is Exodus 12:46. This is one of those moments in the New Testament where the typological fulfillment of the Old Testament is not a matter of interpretation or theological reading. It is a physical, observable fact. The soldiers did not break his bones. They had no religious reason to spare him that detail. They came to do a job and found it already done. The requirement that had governed the form of the Passover sacrifice for 14 centuries was met not by design of those present, but by the sequence of events as they unfolded. Matthew 27:51 records that at the moment of Jesus' death, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Mark 16:38 records the same event in nearly identical language. The tearing came from the top, not from the bottom, as it would have if a person had torn it. The veil in question separated the outer courts of the temple from the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, the space where God's presence was understood to dwell, where the Ark of the Covenant had once stood. Only one person entered that room, and only once a year, the high priest on the Day of Atonement, carrying blood to make atonement for the sins of the people. The veil was the boundary between the accessible and the inaccessible, between the human and the holy. It was not a decorative curtain. It was a theological statement built into the architecture of worship. The presence of God was here, and you could not enter. The book of Hebrews, written to a Jewish Christian audience deeply familiar with temple worship, develops the significance of this tearing at length. Hebrews 9 and 10 argue that the entire system of annual sacrifices The repeated entry of the high priest into the Holy of Holies, the blood of animals offered year after year, was always provisional. It addressed sin without removing it permanently. Hebrews 10:4 states flatly that it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. The sacrificial system was a sign pointing forward to a sacrifice that would actually accomplish what the annual ritual could only represent. When Jesus died, the veil tore. The boundary dissolved. Access to the Holy of Holies. Access to the presence of God. This was no longer mediated through an annual sacrifice, a high priest, and a curtain. The Passover system, the Day of Atonement, the entire sacrificial apparatus of the temple. All of it had been pointing towards this moment, and when the moment arrived, the architecture that had embodied the pointing was torn open from the top down. Taken individually, any one of the connections between the Passover lamb and the crucifixion could be set aside as coincidence or creative reading. Taken together, they form a pattern too detailed to dismiss. The lamb was to be without blemish. Pilate, after examining Jesus, declared 3 times that he found no basis for a charge against him. Peter, writing to scattered Jewish Christians, described Jesus in 1 Peter 1:19 as a lamb without blemish or defect. The requirement of purity that governed the selection of the animal maps onto the repeated declarations of innocence that surround the trial and execution. The lamb was to be a male in its first year. Young at the beginning of its productive life, Jesus was approximately 33 years old at the time of his death. Not an old man who had run his course, but someone in the full strength of adulthood. The lamb was selected on the 10th of Nisan and kept until the 14th. Jesus entered Jerusalem on what the Christian calendar calls Palm Sunday, widely believed to correspond to the 10th of Nisan, and was crucified 4 days later. The city had him in sight for 4 days before the sacrifice. Just as the household watched the lamb in the days before Passover, Jerusalem watched Jesus. The blood of the lamb was applied with hyssop. John 19:29 records that when Jesus said he was thirsty on the cross, a sponge soaked in wine vinegar was put on a hyssop branch and lifted to his lips. Hyssop, the same plant used to apply the blood to the doorpost in Egypt, appears again at the moment of his death. The lamb was to be consumed entirely. Nothing left until morning, the remainder burned. The Gospel of John records that Jesus himself said, just before he died, that it was finished. Not that he was finished, that it was finished. The task, the sacrifice, the fulfillment. Nothing was left incomplete. None of this required a first-century observer to connect every dot in real time. The pattern only becomes fully visible looking backward, with Exodus 12 in one hand and the Gospel accounts in the other. But what becomes visible is not vague thematic resemblance. It is a detailed, point-by-point correspondence between a sacrifice instituted 14 centuries earlier and a death that occurred on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem. Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, stated it in a single line, 1 Corinthians 5:7. Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. The Gospels record the tearing of the veil, but say nothing about how the priests responded to it. That silence in the text has led to considerable historical speculation, and the extra-biblical sources, while not definitive, are worth examining. The veil itself was, by ancient accounts, an extraordinary object. The Jewish historian Josephus describes the temple curtain as being approximately 18 meters tall and as thick as the span of a hand. A woven fabric heavy enough that it required hundreds of priests to hang it. Whether those measurements are precise or somewhat embellished, the point is that this was not a thin partition. Tearing it was not a small event. If the tearing occurred at 3 in the afternoon on the eve of Passover, the temple courts would have been filled with priests conducting the afternoon sacrifice. The sound and sight of the veil tearing would not have been something a handful of people witnessed in a quiet room. It would have been visible and audible to everyone in the inner courts at that moment. The Acts of the Apostles records in chapter 6.7 that a large number of priests became obedient to the faith in the period following the resurrection. That detail is easy to pass over, but its placement in the early history of the Jerusalem church is suggestive. Priests who had been present in the temple at the moment of the veil's tearing, who had seen it happen, who would have had no natural explanation for it, who lived within walking distance of the tomb that was reported empty 3 days later, are recorded as among those who eventually believed. The text does not say that the torn veil converted them. It does not draw that line, but the proximity of these details, the torn veil, the empty tomb, the priests who came to faith, invites a question the text does not answer. What did they see, and what did they do with it in the days that followed? The Passover week was not finished when Jesus died. The feast had a structure, and that structure continued moving forward on its own calendar even as the disciples scattered and grieved. The day after the Sabbath within Passover week, the first day of the new week, was the Feast of First Fruits, Bikurim, the day when the first sheaf of the barley harvest was brought to the priest and waved before God as an offering. It was the day that declared the harvest had begun. Whatever was offered that morning was only the beginning of what was coming. On that exact day, by the account of all 4 Gospels, the tomb was empty. Paul draws the connection in 1 Corinthians 15:20, using the precise language of the feast. Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. He does not say Jesus was the first to rise. The Old Testament records several resurrections before this one. He says Jesus was the first fruits, using the specific term from Leviticus 23 for the offering waved before God on the morning after the Passover Sabbath. The first fruits were not the whole harvest. They were the guarantee of it, the proof that more was coming, the down payment on a resurrection that would eventually include everyone who belonged to him. The timing is almost unsettling in its precision. The lamb died on the day the Passover lambs were sacrificed in the temple. The resurrection occurred on the morning the first fruits were offered. The 2 events that form the heart of the Christian gospel, the death and the resurrection, fell on the 2 days within Passover week that had been marked out in the law of Moses for centuries before either event occurred. This is not the kind of correspondence that can be attributed to a writer shaping a narrative to fit a theological point. The Passover calendar was fixed. The dates were public. Whatever one makes of the resurrection as a historical claim, the alignment of these events with the feast calendar is a fact of the record, not an interpretation layered onto it afterward. The first followers of Jesus were Jewish, and they continued to observe the Passover. The question was not whether to keep the feast, but what the feast now meant. The meal Jesus had shared with his disciples, the bread and the cup identified with his body and blood, became the center of early Christian worship, referred to in various places in the New Testament as the breaking of bread or the Lord's Supper. For several decades, this did not generate significant controversy. The church was predominantly Jewish. The Passover calendar was familiar, and the connection between the feast and the death and resurrection of Jesus was understood within a single, coherent story. As the church spread into Gentile communities across the Roman Empire, however, the relationship to the Jewish calendar became more complicated. By the 2nd century, a serious dispute had developed over the date on which Christians should observe what was becoming known as the Pascha, the Christian Passover, or Easter. The churches of Asia Minor, particularly those in and around Ephesus, maintained the practice of observing it on the 14th of Nisan, the actual date of the Jewish Passover, regardless of which day of the week it fell on. They believed they were following a tradition handed down directly from the Apostle John. These communities became known as Quaturdecimans, from the Latin for 14. The churches of Rome and Alexandria, along with most of the Western Church, observed the resurrection on a Sunday. Specifically the Sunday following the first full moon after the spring equinox, Mur, arguing that the day of the week, not the date of the Jewish calendar, was what mattered, since the resurrection had occurred on the first day of the week. The dispute came to a head in the late 2nd century when Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, and a disciple of John, visited Rome to discuss the disagreement with Bishop Anicetus. Neither man convinced the other, but the two parted in peace, agreeing to disagree. A generation later, the tone had changed. Victor, Bishop of Rome, attempted to excommunicate the Asian churches over the issue, a move that drew sharp criticism from Irenaeus of Lyon, who argued that diversity on the question had existed from the beginning without breaking fellowship. The argument was not primarily about dates. It was about identity, about whether the Christian Passover was a continuation of the Jewish feast, transformed by its fulfillment in Jesus, or whether it had become something distinct enough to require its own calendar entirely. The question was settled, or at least administratively resolved, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The council, convened by the Emperor Constantine, addressed several major theological disputes, of which the Easter dating controversy was one. The outcome was a formal decision to standardize the date of Easter as the Sunday following the first full moon after the spring equinox, calculated independently of the Jewish Passover calendar. The language in the letter Constantine sent to the churches after the council is revealing. He wrote that it was unworthy to have anything in common with the Jews in the celebration of this feast, and that the church should distance itself from the detestable company of the Jews. The theological argument for Sunday observance was real, but it was accompanied by a cultural and political desire to establish a clean separation between the Christian feast and its Jewish roots. The consequences of that decision extended well beyond calendar reform. In the centuries that followed, the connection between Easter and the Passover, a connection that the New Testament assumes and builds upon at every point, became increasingly obscure in Western Christianity. The feast was observed, the death and resurrection were proclaimed, but the texture of Exodus 12, the meaning of the Lamb without blemish, the significance of the timing, all of it receded from the center of how most Christians understood what they were celebrating. What the Council of Nicaea formalized was not simply a liturgical preference. It was a severance, however unintentional in some of its effects, of the New Testament from the Old, a separation of the answer from the question it was answering. The Passover Seder, as observed in Jewish homes today, follows a structure that developed gradually over the centuries following the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. With no temple and no possibility of offering the Passover lamb, the feast became entirely centered on the meal, the reading of the Haggadah, and the retelling of the Exodus story. The lamb is absent from the table, replaced in many traditions by a shank bone that represents the sacrifice without performing it. Near the end of the traditional Seder, a cup of wine is poured for the prophet Elijah, and the door of the house is opened. The gesture is an expression of expectation. Elijah, according to Malachi 4:5, was to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. His cup is poured, the door is opened, and the family waits for a moment before closing it again and continuing the meal. The expectation embedded in that gesture is significant. The Passover for observant Jews is not only a commemoration of something that happened in Egypt, it is also a forward-looking feast. A declaration that the God who rescued Israel from Pharaoh will one day bring about a greater redemption, a final liberation, when the Messiah comes and the exile of the present age is ended. The Seder closes with the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem." For the Christian, the Passover has been fulfilled. The Messiah has come, the Lamb has been sacrificed, the covenant has been established in blood. But the New Testament does not present this as a reason for self-satisfied closure. Jesus himself at the Last Supper said that he would not drink of the fruit of the vine again until he drank it new in the kingdom of God. The Lord's Supper in Christian practice has always carried within it the same forward-looking quality as the Jewish Seder, a declaration that something is still coming, that the story is not yet finished. The Jewish people open the door for Elijah and wait. The church breaks bread and proclaims the Lord's death until he comes. The two gestures are not identical in what they expect, but they share the same structure. A people who remember a past redemption and live in anticipation of one that is still ahead. The book of Revelation is not an easy text, and its imagery has generated more interpretive disagreement than almost any other portion of Scripture. But on one point, it is unusually consistent. The central figure in the heavenly scenes is described not as a conquering king, not as a judge seated in power, but as a lamb. John, the writer of Revelation, records in chapter 5 that he wept because no one was found worthy to open a scroll sealed with 7 seals. Then one of the elders told him not to weep. The Lion of the tribe of Judah had triumphed and was able to open the scroll. John turned to see the lion. What he saw instead, standing at the center of the throne, was a lamb. And the Greek word used is the diminutive form, arnion, suggesting not a full-grown animal, but something smaller, more vulnerable. The lamb appeared as if it had been slain. Revelation 5:9 records the song that followed. "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed people for God, from every tribe and language and people and nation." The language is unmistakably Passover language. Ransom, blood, the liberation of a people. But where the first Passover ransomed one nation from one empire, this song declares a ransom drawn from every nation, every language, the full breadth of humanity. The Lamb appears again and again throughout Revelation. The wrath of God in chapter 6 is described as the wrath of the Lamb. The great multitude in white robes in chapter 7 has washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. The final chapters describe the New Jerusalem lit not by sun or moon, but by the glory of God, with the Lamb as its lamp. The feast that closes the entire book is called the Wedding Supper of the Lamb. From one perspective, Revelation is a complex political and apocalyptic text written to persecuted communities in the 1st century Roman Empire. From another, it is the final chapter of a story that began with a lamb, a doorpost, and a night in Egypt. And it ends with that same lamb, not sacrificed now but enthroned, at the center of a reality that will not end. Step back far enough, and the shape of the whole story becomes visible. It begins with a people enslaved, crying out in a darkness they have known for 400 years, with no visible reason to believe anything will change. It moves through plagues and blood on a doorpost, and a night that divided the world into those under the sign and those who were not. It continues through a wilderness, a promised land, centuries of celebration and forgetting and return, prophets who described a figure they could not fully name, and a carpenter from Galilee who arrived in Jerusalem one spring carrying the weight of everything those centuries had been building toward. He sat at a Passover table and changed the meaning of the bread and the cup. He died at the hour the lambs were being killed. He rose on the morning the first fruits were offered. The veil tore, the tomb was empty. The story that had been moving in one direction for 14 centuries turned a corner that no one standing inside it could have fully anticipated, and then kept moving. The church carried the meal into every culture the gospel reached. The feast that was eaten in haste, sandals on, staff in hand, in a house in Goshen, became a table set in homes and catacombs and cathedrals and house churches on every continent. The blood that was applied to a doorpost with a branch of hyssop became the blood that, according to the New Testament, speaks a better word than the blood of Abel, and cleanses the conscience from dead works. And somewhere, every year since the Exodus, a door has been opened and a cup poured for the one who is still coming. The story of the Passover is not finished. It is not a historical episode that began in Egypt and ended on a hill outside Jerusalem. It is a story with a beginning still visible, a lamb, a doorpost, a night, and an ending still ahead, described in the last pages of Scripture as a supper at which the lamb is no longer on the altar, but at the table, and every exile is finally, irreversibly home. If this video helped you see that connection more clearly, if something clicked that hadn't clicked before, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Share it with someone who would appreciate it. These are the kinds of stories that deserve more than one pair of eyes. And there is someone in your life right now who would be genuinely moved by what you just watched. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. There is much more of this story still to tell. The feasts, the prophets, the figures of the Old Testament whose lives point forward in ways that will surprise you. Every week we go deep into Scripture together, with the same care and the same conviction that these ancient texts have something real to say to people living right now. Subscribe, share, and we will see you in the next video.